The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 12. A Mother-to-be Gets a Midnight Surprise. Dejectedly, Lydia wandered through the giant halls of the gods' rest home, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. She trailed her fingers along the mosaic walls as she passed, frowning vaguely at the gargoyles, busts, and statues of gods and goddesses that lined the hallway. She'd never been so lonely in her life, she thought. Well, at least not in the last life, which was the only one she remembered clearly, and probably not in any of the others that she hadn't remembered yet. Worse, she couldn't seem to make up her mind about anything, her age, or sex, or clothes. Now that she'd learned a few of OverSoul 7's tricks, they weren't half the fun she'd expected. She changed into a male page, looking like an illustration she'd once seen in a history book, then into a young girl dancer in Turkish veils, then, bored, back to herself. But even as herself, she had all those ages to contend with, and none of them contented her, or seemed to fit. She wasn't a young girl, for example, without an old woman's knowledge, even if she could look that way. And she wasn't an old woman, with youth behind her forever, either. She was obviously both, and the more she thought about it, the more confused she became. She supposed that she was out of line, trying to figure out the God business. But on the other hand, she knew that once she was reborn, she wouldn't have the time, or maybe even the inclination. She was getting tired of pilgrimages, though, particularly since OverSoul 7 had left her alone. Suddenly, she realized how important his company had become. She'd met no one since he left her, yet she knew that some people or inhabitants of some kind were invisibly about. Their presence was tantalizingly close and attractive. Now and then she almost heard laughter. Once she almost glimpsed faces. Yet she felt some strange psychological opaqueness, too, that separated her from whoever they were. Musing, Lydia came to a large window, the first she'd noticed in the long passageway. She paused, looking out if out was the proper word, and what she saw struck Lydia through with nostalgia. There, spread out sparkling before her eyes, separated from her only by the window pane, was a snowy scene reminiscent of a Christmas card. An old-fashioned dear scene, she thought, showing farmlands and white-topped mountains. A place where people lived one age at a time, and with only one image to contend with, tucked neatly between night and dawn, birth and death. She pressed her nose against the window, wanting to cry, feeling at the same time like a coward for yearning, as she was now, for a new birth into space and time. Her eyes sprang open. Of course, she thought, that must be Joseph and Bianca's farm. Otherwise, why would she be so drawn to it? More, she felt, again nostalgically, that she already knew each tree and shrub in the yard, each horse in the barn, as if in some indescribable past she'd already lived the life she hadn't yet begun. On the other hand, she was filled with expectation and curiosity, and with such a feeling of suspense that she held her breath. And when she let it out, it suddenly turned into frost against the window. And the air was cold. Lydia shivered and looked around anxiously. At once she knew that she was in the farmhouse. A young woman lay on a bed piled high with mattresses. It was apparently late at night. A fireplace in the corner had died out, and only a few embers leapt up now and then in the darkness. The woman, nevertheless, was perspiring. She was muttering in her sleep, tossing her blonde braided head swiftly back and forth, so that the ribboned blue nightcap trembled. Lydia tiptoed closer. Could that be her future mother? The woman lay on her back, her huge stomach pushing up the coverlets. There were woolen rugs on the floor and a few smaller ones at the foot of the bed. A pitcher of water stood on the bedside table. Lydia nervously hallucinated a cigarette for herself, lit up, and poured herself a glass of water. Forgetting herself, she drank the real thing instead of hallucinating her own. But Bianca, still sleeping, never noticed. "Damn," Lydia muttered. Bianca was lovely, but her own connections were with Joseph. She would be her father's rather than her mother's daughter in that respect. She prowled around the room, eyes narrowed, considering. Bianca's true labor, as opposed to the false one just past, couldn't be put off forever. Just then a motion caught Lydia's eye. She leapt back. Bianca's dream image moved easily up from the bed, pregnant and all, but light-footed and graceful. "Who's there?" asked the dreaming Bianca. Lydia froze. She had little experience in dealing with people's dream selves, and besides, she was suddenly confused because, in relationship to her 20th century life, Bianca had been dead for centuries. But the same applied to Joseph, and she met him fairly often, she thought. And she was, after all, being born back into the past only from the very limited viewpoint of the living. She said softly, "It's Lydia. Well, it's really Tweety. I'm supposed to be born as your daughter." "No, no, no," OverSoul 7 cried, suddenly appearing. "Look younger. Aren't born adult." Startled, Lydia turned into a 3-year-old pudgy, blonde-haired little girl with round face and unswavering, earnest eyes. "Oh!" Bianca cried. She bent over, smiling. But Lydia was suddenly frightened. "Oh, you'll be my baby!" Bianca exclaimed. "And until now I wasn't really sure that I wanted a baby at all, but just to see you." Quickly, Lydia turned back into herself. She strode towards OverSoul 7. "Somehow you engineered this. Somehow." She had second thoughts, too, but she doesn't have them now, 7 said, grinning and pointing at Bianca, who stood staring. She wore her nightgown and carried a hallucinatory candle. Well, I still have second thoughts, Lydia whispered angrily. Oh, I thought I saw my future baby, Bianca cried. Her dream image grew agitated, blurred, was drawn to her body on the bed and, crying, I saw my baby, Bianca woke up. What? Muttered Joseph from his cot in the hall where his mother-in-law had put him for the night. He struggled awake, hearing Bianca's cries through the door. He frowned, wiped his eyes. The bricks they had placed at his feet were cold. There were no windows in the hall, and he hated closed places. Bianca called again. He cursed, not too softly, sat on the edge of the cot and held his head. Besides everything else, he had a hangover, and he missed his own bed. The women had put him out to make room for the cousins, and even his wife seemed to belong to them, or to the house, or to the baby that was supposed to be coming, to anyone, in short, but him. He got out of bed, put his robe on over his nightgown, and opened Bianca's door. The moonlight made a golden white path from the curtained window, reflecting on the kettles and pails that earlier had held boiling water. They sat on the floor by the cold fireplace now, with the light glittering on them, and the piles of rags and other clothes were neatly stacked and ready on the chair. Joseph frowned. He decorated that chair himself, painted on the flower designs that Bianca wanted, and there it sat, blue and pink from the baby's room, if the baby ever came. And the chair reminded him of his own painting, and of the time wasted on the rosebuds, and of the hours yet to come when he'd fail in one way or another to do what he kept telling himself he was determined to do, become a good artist. "Joseph," said Bianca in a small voice. She was on the side of the bed away from the moonlight, so he could hardly see her at all. His head throbbed and his feet hurt, but at the sound of her voice he blushed deeply in the darkness, in shame at his part in her predicament, in anger, after all. Women were supposed to know how to handle such things more easily, and at his own unexpected response to her half-crying voice, he was sexually aroused. He remembered how long it had been since they really bedded, and before he could stop himself, he saw her in his mind's eyes as she'd been, naked and, if not actually slim, well, not as fat as a pregnant cow. The comparison made him further ashamed of himself. He sat on the side of the bed. "Here I am," he said gloomily. "I dreamed I saw her baby, only she was about 3 years old." "She?" Joseph stuttered, half because he always said he wanted a boy, and half because he was cold. Besides, conversation about the baby bothered him. He kept getting the feeling that he actually knew more about the affair than was good for him to know. Snatches of dream encounters with Lydia stirred in his mind. "She looked like you," Bianca said, "except that she was blonde-haired like me." "If she looks like me, God help her," Joseph said, snorting. "Maybe it was a true dream. Maybe I really saw her. Old wives' tales. It was just a plain dream," Joseph said more gruffly than he intended, because Bianca's dream actually made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fathom. His brown mustache bristled. He stared around suspiciously. "What are you looking for? The stork?" Bianca asked. She giggled suddenly. "You look so funny, so gruff and scared." "I'm not scared." "Scared of what?" he demanded. "Of being a father," she said, adding half coquettishly, "You should have thought of that before." "Before what?" he asked, grinning, but still uncomfortable in the big bed where he had to treat her as if she were a virgin instead of a wife. The goose feather mattress softly followed her body contours. He imagined the two of them yelling and shouting in some homey ecstasy. He reached out for her, stopped his hand in midair, and instead lit the bedside candle. "I'll just be glad when we can do it again," he muttered. "It? It? Do what?" she asked softly. She was growing drowsy. She wondered if the baby was sleeping inside her now. "It'll all be over soon," she said. He didn't answer, though he wanted to, because he brooded she'd never really be the same again. She'd be nursing the baby for months, for one thing. He blushed, thinking of it, mentally seeing the full bared breast, bodice loosened. They'd cavort again, but not, he was sure, as they had, like married damn puppies, without a care in the world. His youth, at 26, was gone, and hers at 23, and they were lucky. But Christ, the trouble was that their youth wasn't gone. It kept lingering and wouldn't give up. "You'd do it in a minute if you could, wouldn't you?" he asked, feeling better momentarily. After all, he wasn't dead yet. "I'm a born slut," she said sleepily, smiling because the phrase always cheered him up and made him feel more like an artist with his mistress than like a farmer with his wife. She half roused. It made her feel that way, too. Lydia said nervously, "Let's get out of here. I feel claustrophobic." She and Seven had been silently and invisibly standing there. Joseph managed a fake smile. He said, "Your mother gave me one of the straw cots to sleep on. She treats me like a kitchen hand." "She does not." "Now, snuggling down in those feathers with you would be more like it," Joseph joked, because he thought it was the time for it, but he was growing tired. "I don't think I can do it," Lydia said. "Do what?" Seven asked innocently. "You know what. Be born again. Why can't people just be born at 10? Just arrive somehow full blown?" "You'd better get out of here, though," Bianca said. "If my mother catches you in here now, she'll start yelling and you'll yell back. You aren't supposed to be in here until it's all over." "If it's ever over," Joseph exclaimed. "Do you feel the baby now? Is it kicking or anything?" "I don't know, but I did. Oh God, I did. Now the baby's sleeping, I think." "Maybe it will just go away," Joseph muttered. "Some father he'll make," Lydia said. "We make all these arrangements when he's in the dream state, but he sure doesn't remember them when he's awake, and not all the time when he's dreaming either." Just then dawn streaked across the sky. A gray light filled the room. sound came from downstairs. A cock crowed. "You'd better get back to the cot," Bianca cried. Lydia disconsolately looked at 7, then at the frost-coated window and beyond to the snowy hills. The activity downstairs quickened, and through the window Lydia saw Bianca's brother, Jonathan Hosentoff, go out to the barn, rubbing his gloved hands together, puffing out his cheeks. Smoke was coming from one of the chimneys, and Lydia suddenly realized that now she was looking at the entire scene from above, and that the scene was withdrawing, or she was withdrawing from it. In the next second, she found herself standing back in the long corridor with her face pressed to the gigantic sparkling window, the marble floors beneath her feet, and the entire snowy scene so distant a view from the window that she could hardly make it out at all. She looked around, almost peevishly. For one thing, OverSoul 7 was gone, which made her angrier, and for another, she felt even more indecisive than she had before. Did she really want to be reborn or not? She didn't know, and yet she wasn't pleased with the present situation either. Just thinking about it made her angrier, and at the same time she suddenly felt vehemently, wildly independent. She was tired of going off willy-nilly. She wanted a place of her own, a point of familiarity she could always count on and return to, a place where even OverSoul 7 would be expected to knock first before entering. She wanted, and breathlessly, joyfully, she saw the transition taking place. She imagined a trailer by the ocean, herself, fairly young, there alone, writing poetry, not as if in her last life marrying and having children, with poetry second best, but going it alone as, funny, she thought, Joseph wished sometimes that he had. "Oh," she exclaimed, for the trailer grew up around her, formica-topped table in the front of wide windows, a fake geranium, partially faded but so homey, notebooks piled on the leather built-in benches. She peered out the window. The trailer was only feet from the water. Oh God! She ran out, 20 and barefooted, so delighted that she thought she was, well, alive, and that the ocean would be visited by tourists at least occasionally, just when she felt like company. And she pretended that she had just one space and time to contend with. And she wasn't going to budge, she told herself, until she was good and ready. End chapter 12. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.